Well, hello, welcome back, and welcome in. It is once again me, James Gilly, or or as you can call me, Doc G. We are back for another installment of Government 333 Introduction to Politics of Europe. I don't know why I keep calling it introduction. This isn't an introduction. This is definitely an upper level course in European politics. So, welcome in, everyone. It is good to see you back. This is the first one that we've managed to do live. So, for the rest of the semester, if you're doing this in fall of 2022, if you want to, we'll be doing it on Sunday afternoons. I'll be going live, and you are more than welcome to join in us live. I know Sunday afternoon isn't great, but it's about the best time I'm able to clear out and be able to record for y'all. So we're going to keep going. Today we are going to dig into the European Union as a political institution. So let me go ahead and pull up the slides. Oh, adjust the camera a little bit. There we go. There we go. Okay, welcome in. So this is our 3 lesson unit looking at the European Union as an institution, right? So far we have been focused on how Europe came to be, right? Where this concept of Europe comes from, and how it impacts Europe to today. We have, right, that was what your checkpoint paper was. As I am recording this, there is still time to turn in your checkpoint paper. So make sure, I'm hoping you all got that in. I haven't been able to look at them yet, obviously, because they're still open. So I have high expectations that they're going to be good. But what we're going to be doing moving forward, right, at this point, is examining how Europe, and particularly the European Union, functions as an institution, right? So the European Union is a fairly interesting institutional arrangement. It is in many ways, particularly when we look at the legal perspective, it is what we call a sui generis, or a self-generating institution. There's really nothing else like it on the face of this earth, right? There's a lot of close examples that we can look at, but there's really nothing quite like the European. It is in many ways a one of a kind institution. So we're going to look at how it is set up. We're going to treat it as if it is a state on its own, because it in many ways, like as we've discussed in the last module, does function like a state, right? It has a legislature, an executive, a bureaucracy, a judiciary. It does all the things that a state does, but it's also in an interesting position. So let's go ahead and move to our next slide. Right. As part of its interesting, unique political perspective, institutional perspective, let me adjust the mic real quick. As part of its unique institutional perspective, the European Union has to balance a lot of different problems, right? It is in large part a balancing act about sovereignty, right? All of the 27 member states that are a member of the European Union are themselves sovereign, right? They are sovereign entities that are really holding on to their individual citizen sovereignty for them, right? That's part of that social contract. But extending that social contract a little bit further, the European Union also, in a lot of ways, functions as a sovereign, right? It's like there's a social contract between the individuals and their states, and then between the states and the European Union. But what gets really interesting is that in some ways, in some pretty significant ways, the citizens of Europe, Europeans, at least people that live within the European Union's member states, also directly interface with the European Union. We're going to get into how that works out, but there's a very complicated and complex relationship between the citizens, the states, with the member states of the European Union, and the European Union as a whole. So this is really a very unique institution, right? It has a lot to say about how states can come together, right? It's not kind of a federal, it's not like the United States of Europe. It is not a fully federal system. It is federal ish, but we'll get into that in just a little bit, right? So this is really a unique institution, and it is primarily focused on the idea of governance, while not necessarily being a government. So there's this weird dichotomy that goes on with the European Union. That it administers a territory, administers a people, and in particular, it regulates activities very well. It does a lot of this governance work, right? Setting up rules and enforcing rules, and just generally speaking, doing the work of governing. But at the same time, right, there's no constitution that holds it together, right? There's really not a whole lot of government. It's almost like government by bureaucracy. It's almost as if the bureaucracy is really the part of the institution that is functional. And we're going to get into that, right? The bureaucracy plays a very big and powerful role within the European Union. So we would be remiss not to focus on why that is. In fact, I would say that the most powerful parts of the EU are its bureaucracy. So that leads to this interesting situation where the EU is doing a lot of governing or a lot of governance, but they don't really function like a government. And as we move into this lecture, right, a little bit deeper into this module, and as y'all do the readings for this week, and you're thinking about how this works, right? It's really important to note that in very deliberate ways that the government aspects, right, the institutional aspect of the European Union doesn't inherently work the way that you would think it would work, right? It doesn't. It's not a United States of Europe, right? It's very deliberately not that. It's a very unique institution on its own. Now, the main way that the European Union actually does its work, right, where it derives its power, is predominantly held in its ability to regulate. And not just its ability to regulate, but its ability to unify, right, bring together and make sure that the regulations of the European Union are enacted in the same way across all of the member states, right? It unifies regulation, right? So this unification of regulation is really the main power that lets the EU do its thing. I'm going to throw an asterisk on that small a comment solid side on that. Really, the power comes in its ability to regulate its money, right? Its currency through the euro, right? We're going to talk about the European Central Bank at the end of today's lesson. And next module is going to entirely focus on European Union political economy. And that's really where the EU has its power, right? It was always meant to be a trade and customs union, which it is. It became a monetary union. And more of these governance things, right? This ability of the EU as a state to regulate and function and do governance work has expanded over the years, leading to some controversies, leading to Brexit, right? You saw that I started off today's slides with kind of someone chipping away at one of the stars in the EU flag. Right, that was a Brexit political cartoon, and a lot of that comes from this tension in the fact that the EU does really intangible ways do governance, but not a great job of government. Right, it does a very poor job of allowing its people to have a say in the system. Right, and I think it's important for us to remember at this point that really governments only have three tools available to them. Everything that a government does is going to fall into one of those three categories up there. Right, the ability to give people money, the ability to take money from people, or right, taxation authority, and the ability to use force. And the EU does these three things, but they wield regulations in kind of the same way that you would think of another state using policing powers, right? So in some ways, regulation's almost a fourth tool, or it takes the role of the use of force, although they do kind of have the ability to use force as well there. So the EU, right, it's this weird mishmash, this new, right, I don't even know if I want to call it a mishmash. It's a new institution, right? It's different than everything else that we've ever seen. And right? There's some really significant problems that come about because of the way the EU functions. And I think the biggest one of these that we need to start off with before we even dig deep into the institutions themselves is this question of like, where does it get its authority? Where does the EU get its authority from? As we talked about last module, the EU is not something that has a constitution, right? It functions as a series of treaties that hold it together, right? The treaties are the primary instrument that lets the EU do its job, right? All of the institutions we're going to talk about today only function because there is a treaty holding it together, right? Particularly this Treaty of Lisbon. But that has some pretty big complications, right? That makes everything that the EU does what we call a two-level game, right? This is a big Robert Putnam thing. Robert Putnam's a pretty famous political scientist operating really across all the subfields in political science. But his big international relations observation is about these two-level games. This idea that if you want to do something in an international way, you have to negotiate it and deal with it simultaneously at that international level and in each and every nation, right? The individual nation states that want to sign on to it. So you have to have an international consensus and be able to tie that to a national consensus in every state that wants to be a part. So it's really a complicating factor, right? It is not an easy thing to do to get to get things done, and this especially applies at the EU. If the EU wants to accomplish anything, it still, in many ways, has to deal with kind of a two-level game. Although it gets really complicated, right? The EU is, in some ways, supranational, right? It rides on top of the nation states and can actually override a lot of the internal politics in its member states. That leads to some pretty big consequences down the road, and it leads to a lot of states questioning what the EU actually does, and not in a like what are they doing sort of way, but in like the actual outputs that the EU does, right? That they end up being kind of problematic. And what really complicates this is the wide range of states that are members of the EU, right? There is a wide variety of states within Europe, from very small countries like Malta all the way up to Germany, who is, right, the biggest and most powerful state left in the European Union, right? Great Britain pieced out. They left. So there is a pretty significant problem in trying to get that two-level game done, right? There's no single, right, European party structure. It really creates a lot of problems, right? You have to deal with both the internal politics in every member state at the same time as you're dealing with what Europe as a whole can do. So it's very complicated and complex to get Europe to function. But I think it's important at this point to actually take a step back and look at what and how the EU is set up. So we're gonna do one of those government institution maps. If you've taken comparative politics with me, you've seen a bunch of these before. This is a pretty standard thing in political science. So let's take a look at it. So let me pop that up here for you. This is the EU map. Here, let me hide myself for a second so you can see this bottom corner as well. So what we've got here is really the right connection between the citizens in the member states, the European parliaments, the executives of all of the states, and how they're all tied together, right? We see both, we see executive, we see legislative, we see judiciary up here, and then we also see the central bank, because it's really hard to not acknowledge the role of the central bank. Now I'm going to walk through each of the branches of government over the course of today's lecture. But I think it's important for you to be able to see, right, visualize how everything is tied together. So the citizens of the member states elect their own national governments, their parliaments and governments within the member states, and the heads of those states sit on the European Council, and the Council of they select the ministers who sit on the Council of the EU. Think of that more on the executive side of things. Although the European Commission really fits that role explicitly. Additionally, the citizens of the member states elect into a European Parliament. The European Parliament doesn't have the ability to create legislation. It's more of a rubber stamp and directs how the European Commission is going to function. They have a built-in auditor court. They have their own court of justice that's divided. Right there's a lot going on, but it is really important to note that that right that the internal politics in every member state and the politics of Europe as a whole have to interact with each other, and they very deliberately do so like this. So that we're gonna go through this a little bit more, well, really in depth. That's what we're doing today, is looking at how this system functions. Right, we're just looking at functioning. Next week, we're going to look at political economy, and the next module after that, we'll be looking at how the EU presents itself to the rest of the world. So we're going to be getting into the politics of it this week. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So if you want, I'll probably refer back to this chart a couple of times throughout the course of this week. I might even pop us back to it. So bear with. Let's go. So when I'm doing an exploration of how how political institutions are put together, how states are put together, I like to talk about how they make laws. Right, first, I think that's the best place to start. That's kind of the job of a state, is to come up with laws and put them into practice. So I think where a state puts together its laws and the process by which they do that is a really good place to start. So the European Parliament is a directly elected parliament. If you are a member state of the European Union, every 5 years, you're going to directly elect a minister of the European Parliament. So you apart from your regular national elections, there are European elections if you're in the EU. And these elections, right, every 5 years, you will vote for a member of parliament, a member of European Parliament, an MEP, to represent you. Right, you're going to go and you're going to cast a ballot. I think it's important to note when you're doing this that there are no international, there are no European parties. It's more like there are some political groupings and coalitions that exist. So there is no European blank party. You're voting for a national politician to represent you in the European Parliament. So it can get really complicated. But the big difference is there's no prime minister of the European Union as well. You're not electing the people and Parliament aren't selecting who their executive is. It doesn't function that way. So that leads to some interesting downstream consequences. So when electing the European Parliament, there are 705 seats available, and these seats are apportioned based on the population of the member states. So Germany has the most seats at 96. France has the second most, somewhere in the 70s, and you can go all the way down to something like Malta that has 6 seats. So there's a wide spread of seats. They are apportioned by population. There's some justice in it. So that's how they select their members of the European Parliament. And once people are sent to the European Parliament, they kind of fit into political groupings with each other. So the EUP really does have some political groupings within it, but they're not parties, right? They're more like kind of ad hoc coalitions that crop up, right? There is no single coalition of European government because they don't have to select a prime minister, right? There's no prime minister of Europe. We'll talk about in a bit how the executive functions, but the executive doesn't function. There's no single executive. The buck stops there. They're directing policy. Right? There's 27 member states that all get to have a say in how policy, the direction policy is going to take. So while you see kind of political clusters emerge, right, left wing or social democrats, Greens, liberals, conservatives, Eurosceptics, and then conservative Eurosceptics. Those are two different things. And then kind of far right nationalists, right? Those are kind of your groupings that you see. They don't coalesce into parties, if you. They don't really have to do that. It's more like, who are the people with similar ideological leanings to me, and they don't really matter all that much. People love to get together in groups. They will absolutely do that, but they're not going to function the same way that, say, parties within a state are going to function. Don't think of them like that. That's not how they work. Because, and that's, I think, is the most important portion of why they don't set up a parliament, right? Why they don't do parties. It's because the European Parliament does not have the right to initiate legislation. They don't have the right of initiative. They don't get to write laws. Right? They don't get to propose bills. That actually comes from a different part of the institution. So they're really more of a rubber stamp. They're a lobbying platform to get the European Commission to push laws in a certain direction. They can push through legislation. They can approve legislation, but they don't get to start the legislative process. Where they do, however, play a big role is that they set and approve the budget. And if you can control the keys to where the money goes, then you can really control the government pretty heavily. So, on the one hand, they don't get to. Excuse me, I don't know if I'm going to ever make it through one of these without yawning. It's not a bored thing. It's I seem to do this at a time when I'm always needing a little nap ski. Sorry about that. Right. So the European Parliament does not have the ability to create legislation, but they do have the ability to set the budget. So there's a really weird tension about power that goes on. They have the power of the purse, but they don't have the power to actually pass bills. So that, right, like I said, that puts them in a weird place, right? Right. They have really heavily divided, right? Maybe in more ways than in the U.S., they have divided up power very heavily. There is a lot of divided power within the European. And of course, everything's a two-level game, right? We got to go back to that. One thing that the EU Parliament does do, right, the European Parliament does do, is they have the ability to select the president of the European Commission. And the European Commission is really the executive, right? So they get to approve who the overall executive is, and they have some pretty heavy oversight authority over the bureaucracy. But they do not really have the ability to write bills and laws. And, well, that's also kind of part and parcel of what the EU is. They don't really have bills and laws. They have regulations and how they're enforced. Right? That's really where the power is. So writing bills and laws, even though they don't have that power, right, it's not really that big of a miss for them, because that's not where the real power in the EU is. Hope we're good so far. So let's complicate this even further. There is another set of legislative institutions within the EU, and this is the Council of the EU. This is populated by state ministers, right? So like Minister of Finance, Minister of Defense of the various countries, right? Its membership actually varies based on what they're discussing. It has 10 different configurations that it can be assembled in, and it varies based on whatever topic they're actually talking about. Right? This kind of functions like a Senate because it's meant to represent the interests of the states themselves. So the interest of Malta, the interest of Luxembourg, the interest of Germany, right? The state minister of the relevant issue shows up. So the presidency of a council is assigned to a member state. So every 6 months, it'll be something like Latvia, Estonia, Greece, right? It'll rotate through. Right? It's a rotating 6-month presidency, and they convene the council. They bring together the council when it's needed for whatever configuration it needs. And there are 10 different ways that the Council of the EU can be brought together. So there's the general affairs configuration. So that's kind of just basic Europe stuff. There's the foreign affairs. That one's been meeting a whole lot in the last 6 months. Economics and finance, agriculture, justice, employment and social policy, competitiveness, transportation, telecommunications and energy, environment, and then finally education, youth, culture, and sport. So the relevant ministers of all of the member states that for each particular thing will meet in whatever configuration. I know that's a little bit confusing, but think of it as if, right, you would bring together the Senate in the United States to, right, if they're concerned about employment issues, you would send the, right, every state's Secretary of Labor to go and represent there. If it's energy policy or telecommunications policy, you'd send the relevant secretary there, and they would all meet to discuss that particular thing. So they're much more experts on the particular thing they're meeting about. And they're the ones that actually have some authority to push through legislation. They're there to represent the states explicitly. And in order for them to pass anything, they have to do something called double majority, qualified majority voting. That's a big mouthful. But what it amounts to is that in order for something to pass, it has to be approved by 55% of the states that make up 65% of the total population of Europe. So it can be any configuration of states that approve it, as long as they are more than half, right, 55% of the total number of states, and they represent 65% of the total population of Europe. This allows small states to get some stuff through, but it also allows the big states, right, particularly Germany and France, to play a big important role in how the EU functions. So not every state is equal, right? They have to be able to put together a population majority as well as a pure state majority as well. So, and it's a pretty hefty population majority. That's 65%. You're pretty much not going to get anything done if you can't get either Germany or France aboard. And realistically, you need both because they're the biggest population in the entirety of the EU. Okay, so that was the legislature. The legislature is primarily composed of that European Parliament as well as the European Council. Right? That is those bits up there. Right? The European Council, which is made up of its heads of state or its government people. Sorry, no, that's the Council of the EU. Right? This gets super complicated because there's the Council of the EU and then the European Council. So, Council of the EU and European Parliament, those are your legislatures. Okay? That's the legislature. You can think of the European Parliament as a weak House of Representatives, and you can think of the Council of the EU as a weird Senate. Good so far? I know it can be confusing, right? The EU is a weird, confusing, patched together institution, but we're working our way through it. So let's get back to the executive, right? Our executive here is kind of this top level, this European Council, which is different than the Council of the EU, and the European Commission, right? That's going to be our executive branch. So the biggest and perhaps most important executive body, maybe not the most powerful one, but the most important one, is the European Council. Not the Council of the EU, but the European Council. The European Council is made up of all of the European Union's head of states. So for the 27 member states, their prime minister or their president, whoever is the most powerful head of state / head of government person within that state goes and meets as part of the European Council. They do that 4 times a year, quarterly. And that's where the agenda is set. So in many ways, right, they are filling that head of government role as an executive without inherently being right, the ones enacting things, right? So their policy setting, they're not actually putting things into practice. This would be like really heavily separating the president as policy setter from the bureaucracy. The European executive is shepherded. It's led by a president of the European Council who is approved by the Parliament. They serve 2.5-year terms for a 2-term limit of 5 years. Their job is to be chief cat wrangler of all of the most powerful people within Europe, all the most politically powerful people in Europe. They get them all in one room, convene them, and oh, so sorry, didn't mean to hit the mic. They get them all together, convene them, and get them functioning to set the agenda for what the European Parliament's going to do, what the Council of the EU is going to do, and ultimately how the regulations and governance of Europe is going to take place. So they're super important in that role, but they're not as important in actually putting things into practice, right? So in many ways, the executive has been broken up into several different little sub branches. The EU executive, right, the European Council is just there to set the agenda. And right, these are all the top politicians in their country, so you can see how difficult it could be to get them all on the same page to set an agenda. Right, you got to play that 2-level game. The next big institution is kind of oversight. Right, it's taking the oversight role of both the legislature and the executive that we would kind of lump together here, and making it independent. Everybody wants to make sure the EU is functioning properly. So they have created a court of auditors. Now, let's go back and look at that. This court of auditors, the European Court of Auditors, is selected both by the Council of the EU and the European Parliament together, and they fill a very specific role. There are 27 members, one per member state, that sit as auditors of the entirety of the EU. They will serve 2 6-year terms, and every year they put out an audit report about how the money is being spent, how power is being wielded. They are officially empowered auditors, and they're auditing, right? The thing they're auditing is the European Union's government itself. And they have to do it every year, right? So in order to be a member of this auditors council, you have to be independent, you have to be qualified, and you have to be explicitly non-political. Right, it's pretty stringent to become a member of the ECA, right? The European Court of Auditors. And accordingly, right, they kind of do their own internal governance. They select their own president. They govern themselves because they're meant to be independent and oversee the rest of the European Union's government. Now, things get weird. Where things get interesting is that there's 27 of them, and the things that they all want to do, right, they're very widely distributed. Right, European Union, this is that 2-level game again. Everything within Europe kind of is reflected, is having to go through this consensus making, right? Since they put out one audit report every year, they have to gain a consensus about how things are working. And it's really difficult to do that, right? We've started to see a lot more internal political wrangling going on, right? We've seen the ECA become much more of a political body over the past several decades, because it's just so difficult to actually get 27 independent auditors to build a consensus. So in many ways, the audit report itself has become a political entity, and it's become a political document. And to get it to be able to do its job, it's really hard, right? With 27 people, right, 27 independent entities, independent people on this board, it's really hard for it to do its job. So the more difficult it becomes to actually do your oversight role, the less oversight ends up actually happening. And that's perhaps to the detriment of the EU as a whole, right? They're not maybe being overseen to the degree that they are meant to be seen. Yeah, so that creates some pretty big problems within the European Union. So that's right. So you have kind of the agenda setting portion of the executive. You have an oversight portion of the executive, but then you actually have the what I'm going to say is probably the most important political body within the European Union, and it really functions as the true executive branch within the European. And that's the European Commission. The European Commission is the bureaucracy, right? It is the bureaucracy that is putting uh, law into practice, right? It has regulatory power. It is in a very tangible way ruled by bureaucrats, right? Officially, their role are the guardians of the treaties. Right, that's a high-minded title that might be the worst comic book of all time, worst superhero team of all time. They're the guardians of the treaties. That's what the European Commission does. They enact the will of the treaties, right, that hold the European Union together. And there are a bunch of bureaucrats. They're, oddly enough, also responsible for proposing legislation. So the bureaucrats get to write the bills that go through the legislature. This is what they are the ones with the power of legislative initiation. They're the ones who pass bills into the parliament to be voted on. And that's a really weird situation, I think. But it for good or for ill works for them. This is, as I said, very tangibly ruled by bureaucrats. The main actual remit, the main actual job of this European Commission is to directly run the administrative operations, right? They set out how the administration is going to happen. They set out the agenda for how bureaucracy is going to take place. So the European Commission itself is made up of 27 members, one per member state. But if you're a member of the European Commission, you're not as directly tied to the member state you're from. You're there as a representative of them, but you are sworn to do, like, to further the European Union as a whole, right? You actually explicitly set up to represent Europe as a whole. You are there and sworn to do good for the EU, not to represent your member state. So in some ways, when you become a European commissioner, even though you're from one of the member states, you're not there for the member state. You are there for you, which kind of funky, but not necessarily in a bad way. It's just different, right? As I said, the EU is a different sort of institution. It's unique. So making up the bureaucracy, right, are these 32,000 civil servants, right? They're the actual authority within the European. They're the ones who actually deal with Europe as a whole, right? They're the ones that deal with policy making and policy enacting, and they are divided up into 35 directorates general, right? So the directorates general are kind of what you could think of as the ministries of Europe, right? Or the departments of Europe. These are the 35 elements of the bureaucracy. So I want to walk you through them. I don't expect you to remember all of these. I just want to illustrate for you the sorts of things that are being influenced and are being regulated and governed within the European Union. So, right, this truly is the executive, right? This European Commission is actually the power. Now, I'm not going to say they're the most powerful thing in the EU. That's actually going to go towards the European Central Bank. But the European Commission is probably the most important thing for you to know as the central core of power within the EU. So let's take a look at these directors general. I want to give you the abbreviation that they roll by, and I'm going to, we'll talk about what they actually do. Notice that there's actually 27 European commissioners. Some of these are actually double dipped, right? Some European commissioners actually have more than one directorate general they're responsible for. So that's important to know. So let's take a look at them, shall we? There's a lot. We're going to go through each one of these just very briefly to talk about what they are and what they're doing. The first is agricultural and rural development under the European Commissioner for Agriculture and Rural Development. Most of these do exactly what they say they do. Right? This is responsible for European agriculture and for, helping rural development occur, right? Helping people that live in rural areas get a little bit of a better life. The second is the budget. The budget is super important, right? If you can control where the money goes, you can control what gets done. So the European Commissioner for Financial Programming and the budget is responsible for how the money flows. Now, that's not to say that they are inherently responsible for the money. They're not a treasurer. They're just responsible for the budget. There's climate action, right? European Commissioner for Climate Action, right? Doing all the climate stuff. There's communication, right? How communications occurs within Europe. Communication networks, content and technology, or a CNECT. That's under Commissioner for the Digital Agenda. That's right, kind of the internet and digital communications fit under that. Competition. European Union Commissioner for Competition. They want to make sure that they are economically competitive with other players, right? So that's almost the Ministry of Industrial Policy to some degree. It gets a little complicated. There's the Data Protection Officer, who's responsible for, European data protection. Not only of the European Union itself, but also, you know how when you go to a website and you have to click the I accept the cookies thing? That's actually an EU law that everyone has to hold to because the EU passed it. And because it's on the internet, it affects everyone. So Data Protection Officer is the one who's playing a big role there. Economic and Financial Affairs, or ECFIN. That is the Commissioner for Economic and Financial Affairs. That would be something like Secretary of Commerce, I think would fit pretty close as an analog of that. Education and Culture, EAC. That is the European Commissioner for Education, Culture, Multilingualism, and Youth is responsible for that. So that one's the one that wears a couple of different hats as well. Education and Culture. Makes sense. Employment, Social Affairs, and Inclusion is making sure that people have jobs and that social affairs are taken care of. All that jazz. European Commissioner for Energy, they're playing a big important role right now, making sure that Europe is going to have enough energy through the winter since they're not engaging with Russia circa October of 2022. Environment works pretty heavily with climate action. They interact pretty well with each other, but they are separate European commissions with separate European commissioners. European Civil Protection and Humanitarian Aid Operations, that's ECHO. They're responsible for international cooperation, dealing with crises, humanitarianism. They're under the remit of the European Commissioner for International Cooperation, Humanitarian Aid, and Crisis Response. They want to make sure that Europe is responding well to humanitarian issues, see refugee crises, see what's going on with Ukraine. There you go. Eurostat is the European Commissioner for Tax, Customs Union, Audit, and Anti-Fraud. They are keeping statistics on taxes. They do auditing stuff, right? They're probably closest to what we would think of as the IRS here in the United States. FSMA is Financial Stability, Financial Services, and Capital Markets Union, right? That would be like the Federal Exchange Commission and the Securities Exchange Commission rolled into one. They're responsible for European financial markets. Santé is Health and Food Safety. Important. HR is Human Resources and Security. They're the HR people within the EU. When you're dealing with 32,000 bureaucrats, you need a pretty good HR department. Digit is Informatics. They're responsible for information within the EU. GROW is the internal market industry, entrepreneurship, and SMEs. That is the Commissioner for Industry and Entrepreneurship. That is pretty big industrial policy and the like. INTPA is the Director General for International Partnerships. That is the European Commissioner for Development. They do international partnerships, specifically economic international partnerships. SCIC is interpretation. When you've got 27 different languages floating around, 27 different states, you're going to need an entire group to do interpretation. The Joint Research Center is responsible for European innovation and science development. That's the JRC. JUST is Justice and Consumers. That is the European Commissioner for Justice, Fundamental Rights, and Citizenship. They're responsible for kind of consumer rights. MARE is Maritime Affairs and Fisheries. They deal with European fish and fishing, which is actually a surprisingly complex issue. It's really complex. So it's kind of important to make sure that all the fishing rights are being dealt with. Home is the Migration and Home Affairs. Think of that as kind of internal movement of populations. MOVE is Mobility and Transportation, European Commissioner of Transport. They're responsible for transportation. NEAR is Neighborhood and Enlargement Negotiations. That's about should the European Union expand, how they're going to do it, and development within. Regio is Regional and Urban Policy, right? Development of within regions of the European Union. RTD is Research and Innovation, also under the office, the European Commissioner for Research, Innovation, and Science. It's Research and Development. Tax UD is the Taxation and Customs Union, also under the remit of the Taxation and Customs Union Audit and Anti-Fraud guy, making sure that kind of things moving across borders, right? The taxation works properly there. Trade is European Commissioner for Trade. And finally, DGT is the Directorate General for Translation. So not just interpretation, but translation, making sure that all of the documents are in the same, are the same thing across all the languages. There's a lot there, right? There's a lot going on with these directorates general. They do a lot of different things, but they are the primary bureaucracy, right? The largest part of the European Union are these bureaucracies. They're the ones doing the day-to-day governance, and they have the ability to figure out what sorts of bills and legislation the European Union needs to function. So in many ways, these are the bureaucrats that are doing the rule by bureaucracy that the European Union is, right? The governance with questionable government. These are the ones doing the governance. Let's move on. Finally, two more branches of the government. First is the judiciary. There is a lot of movement, particularly in the 90s and 2000s, to unify the justice system within the European Union. And it's done so under the courts of justice, which are divided into two separate groups. They don't really do a lot of unified criminal law. They allow these states themselves, right, the member states, to handle most of the criminal stuff. What the Court of Justice is responsible for is relations within Europe. The Court of Justice itself is responsible for interpreting European law and the EU treaties, and they're particularly responsible for serving the European Union and its member states when there is a disagreement or a legal question about the treaties or about how the laws that are passed within Europe function and how they interact with domestic laws. That is what the Court of Justice does. Think of them as a Supreme Court that just does interpretation of the EU treaties and EU law. It's really complicated, right? They don't have a constitution to lean on, so they have to figure out how the treaties, right? It's this two-level game again, right? How the treaties and how internal laws and how European laws all interact with each other. So to do this, they have 27 judges, one per member state, who all try to come together and get a consensus on what these laws mean. Assisting in the work, there are 11 advocates general. They serve kind of as state attorneys for the European Union. They're the ones who kind of fit the role of defense attorney for the EU, if you will. They also kind of do a little bit of prosecution, but right, it's less about that, and it's more about they argue on behalf of the state. Right, they're the advocate for the EU as a state. It's a little bit weird, right? The EU justice system is kind of one thing, but then trying to interpret how things fit in with the treaties and the laws that get passed is a whole other deal. The other side of the court is the general court. This one represents the people within the system. They deal really heavily with competition law, right? Kind of protecting competition between people, how states receive their money, how trade carries out, agriculture, trademarks, etc. They're almost more of a business court. Almost, they're fitting the role of um, right, the court that deals more with the people and represents how the people interface with the government. The Court of Justice is more how the member states interface with the EU. The General Court's more how individuals interface with the EU, if that makes sense. There are 54 judges. Well, there are 54 seats for judges within the General Court. There are currently only like 49 of them. They haven't filled out all the seats currently, but they are responsible for kind of representing and dealing with the people. Now, where things get especially weird, because it's all treaties all the way down, they don't have a procuracy. They don't have a adversarial political system, judicial system. They have their own thing. It is a sui generis legal system. It is like nothing else on the face of the earth. It is unique. They even call it a sui generis legal system, and there's really no other way to talk about it. Right? It doesn't really have analogs to anything you might be familiar with, any of the member states. Right? It is its own thing. Its legal system is its own thing. It's kind of ruled by bureaucrats. Again, this is ruled by bureaucrats, right? It is how the bureaucracy interprets things and then how that interfaces with the treaties in the individual states. Just as another aside, they work in French. That's their working language. The parliament itself works in English with a heavy German influence. It's especially weird that it works in English now that the English aren't in the EU, but it's kind of a common language for the functioning of politics. But everything comes out in English. Well, it comes out in all of the languages, but the primary working languages, other than English, are German and French. That's really where the work's kind of being done, is in those three languages. So yeah, that's your judiciary. It is its own weird, right, self-generated system. It's not like anything else you've ever seen. And finally, and this is more, think of this more as a jumping off point than as an ending point. It's where we're going to put a pin in it for this week, but it's what we're going to really heavily focus on next week. This last branch is the European Central Bank, and if we go back to our thing, right, notice it is not connected to anything else on this list. It's off by itself. It is an independent agency. It does its own thing, but it has to be talked about as part of the government of the EU because it's really the most important part. Remembering that the EU starts off as a customs and tariff union, eventually becomes a monetary union. Economics is central, right? It is at the core of what the EU is doing and how it came to be. So the European Central Bank is its primary remit, its primary job is to set Eurozone monetary policy. And they don't do fiscal stuff. And we'll talk about that difference next class. But they're responsible for managing the euro. They're responsible for issuing notes, right? So you go to the EU and you get a banknote. I don't have any on me. I believe I spent my last euros on the way out. The last time I was flying out of Ireland. So I don't have any on me. But right there, the EU is responsible. The European Central Bank is responsible for the banknotes, the paper money. The member states are responsible for the coins, right? So there's a difference there, right? All the states can make all the coins they want, but the ECB is responsible for the notes. It's important to note that they don't have control over fiscal policy. They don't get to say how the money is spent. They just control the supply of money. And their biggest mandate beyond anything else, right? Unlike the Federal Reserve in the US that has price stability, right? Fighting inflation. and unemployment, the ECB is only responsible for price stability. That is their only job, right? Their job is to manage the euro itself, make sure it's stable, make sure it's worth a stable amount of money. Let's just check right now today. It is right. It was introduced at about $1.30 to a euro. Ooh. It's at parity right now, dollar to euro, even exchange. So it has weakened compared to the US dollar. So as long as it remains relatively stable, it's okay. Let's look at how it's done over time. Just because it's fun to look at. And we're going to dig deeper into this next week, right? But the job of the European Central Bank is to keep prices stable. It's been fluctuating between about 97 cents and just over $1 over the last month or so. If we look at 60 days, yeah, from $1.05 down to 96 cents. That's actually not super unstable. That's probably still okay, but it has diminished from where it began. So the EU, right, the euro has relative stability without full stability. So the ECB, right, the ECB does have its hands tied by a lot of things as well. We'll talk more about that next unit, especially because it's important to note that the European Central Bank actually gets to consult on any issue, both nationally or right within the nation member states or within the EU, on anything that falls under its competence, right? Anything that the European Central Bank could have a say on, they get to actually interfere in domestic politics and overall EU politics, which is kind of interesting. And we will definitely go more in depth on that next module. But the big thing that's important to note is the ECB strictly does monetary regulation. They don't do fiscal policy. So while they do get to impinge on value of the euro, they don't get to really do much about how states are spending their monies. So that creates a lot of political economic tension, right? Enough that we need to talk about EU political economy as its own module. So that's what we're going to do, right? It is going to be its own thing. We are right at about an hour now, which is right about what I had expected for today. So that's great. Thank you all for being here. Remember to do your assignments and move on. I do have readings up on Moodle for you. Make sure you read those. Make sure you do all the things you need to do. I'm right. If you're in the fall 2022 version of this class, your paper proposal, right, 300 word paper proposal is also due this week. So make sure you get that in as well. So thank you for joining me. Thank you for being here this afternoon. If there are any questions, do not hesitate to reach out to me, contact me. That's what I'm here for. But if there are no questions, thank you for being here. Thank you for paying attention. And I will see you in the next module. Have a great day.